Welcome to London Futurists, and welcome especially to everyone joining us today for the first time, perhaps as a result of discovering the London Futurist podcast, and then exploring the other activities of London Futurists on our meetup page and noticing the subject of today's webinar, the prospects for universal basic income. Before moving into today's discussion, let me briefly draw attention, for those of you who haven't noticed them before, to some of the more recent episodes of our podcast. This includes analysis of some profound changes in the capabilities of artificial intelligence with one of IBM's most senior executives, Alessandro Curioni, the opportunities and risks arising from quantum computing with Dr. Ignacio Cirac, who is spoken of as a possible future Nobel Prize winner, and options to govern the transition from today's relatively narrow AI to the general AI of the near future, with the guest in that case being Jerome Glenn, the Executive Director of the Millennium Project. But back to today. Back to the challenges caused by present-day AI and automation, to the issues faced by a growing precariat, and to options for a different kind of social contract. Our speaker today is perhaps a future Nobel Prize winner himself for peace, Scott Santens. Scott has been researching and advocating since 2013 for the concept of unconditional universal basic income. He was described by former US presidential candidate Andrew Yang as being, quotes, the OG, the original UBI godfather, my inspiration and educator for many things, end quote. Scott is currently the senior advisor for Humanity Forward and also serves on the board of director of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity and as the editor of Basic Income Today, a daily UBI news hub. If you like what you hear from Scott and want to support his work, please look him up on Patreon and join his group of more than 240 patrons there. Scott, I'm really looking forward to hearing your update on how the global conversation on UBI is moving forward. The floor is yours.
Okay, so we'll be talking about the prospects for unconditional basic income, the state of UBI in 2023 after 3 years of a pandemic. As David already mentioned, here's who I am. Also, I have a book called Let There Be Money. And yeah, I've been living with a crowd-funded basic income since 2015. So not only do I talk about it, I use one to fuel my my work. So before we go on, I always like to set the definition here of basic income, so everybody knows what we're talking about. And a basic income has 4 primary components in order to be called a basic income. It needs to be unconditional, universal, individually provided, and periodic. So unconditional as in no work requirements. You get it whether you work or don't work. It adds to all work. Universal, everyone gets it. It's not just for the poor. It's not just for the middle class. It's for everybody. And individuals, and it doesn't go to the head of the household. It goes to each and every person. And it needs to be periodic. So that can be monthly, quarterly, annually, but it needs to be repeating. That is a basic income. Here's what a basic income essentially looks like. So everyone receives the same basic income floor, and everyone pays taxes based on their income and or consumption. So I think a chart like this helps people understand that everyone gets the same floor, but also everyone pays a different amount of taxes depending on the tax setup and how much their income or consumption is. So yes, the rich receive basic income, but they're also going to be net payers and not net recipients. So you see that it does reduce inequality And the amount, of course, depends on the amount of UBI and the funding choices. I also think it's helpful to think of UBI in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So today, we ask these questions like, can we afford UBI? Won't people stop working with UBI? Won't inflation nullify UBI? And should we fear automation taking our jobs? And I think that once we have UBI, we're going to be looking backwards at things now as they are now. And we're going to be thinking, how did we afford not having UBI? Like, how did we afford poverty and extreme inequality and insecurity? Why did we ever think that UBI would prevent work instead of actually enabling so much work? And why did we ever accept inflation absent UBI? And also, of course, why don't we just automate everything we possibly can? And why did we ever push against automation or fear automation? And of course, there's what UBI isn't, and that, of course, is welfare. A lot of people think of basic income as welfare for all, and that's not the case at all. Any type of means-tested, targeted program actually ends up excluding many, many people, and often more people than it includes. So here in the US, here's just a few of our different programs. SNAP is our food assistance program, TANF is our cash assistance program, and then we also have disability income and unemployment income. And as you can see, SNAP, our food assistance program, is our best one as far as coverage. It reaches 2 out of 3 people, but it leaves out 1 out of 3. And TANF is, I think, our worst one on average. It reaches 1 out of 5 people, but it varies state by state. So in my previous state in Louisiana, it left out 96 out of every 100 people in poverty. And disability, this is true actually everywhere across the world too, since there's so many disability programs out there, that most people with disability do not receive disability income. And the process to qualify for it, the concern about losing it is always there. And of course, unemployment, you only get it when you're unemployed. You lose it when you gain employment. And that's just not true with UBI. UBI is a floor that reaches everybody. So it's not to say that you should replace things like disability or unemployment, but the fact remains that if you actually want to reach everyone with a disability and you want to reach everyone who is unemployed, then it's important that you should have a floor and that you don't punish people with high marginal tax rates for actually accepting employment. Okay, so with that said, what just happened? COVID-19 hit in 2020. We all know governments around the world responded. Interestingly, no one did a full UBI. I really thought the window had opened for at least one government to temporarily do basic income, and no one did it. The closest was actually Tuvalu. They were one of the countries that did a fully universal payment, and they did it for like 2 months in a row. So you could say that they had a very, very temporary UBI, but at the same time, it could just be, back-to-back stimulus payments. But it actually was, I think, a big deal that that some countries did actually do universal payments. And that was South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Philippines, Singapore, Serbia, Israel, Tuvalu. And I added here Taiwan and asterisk, just because this is actually something that just happened, some new news that happened. And that's that Taiwan, as a response to COVID, did a means-tested, targeted cash program, and also a fully universal voucher program. And they learned from that they actually should have done universal cash. So they're actually going to do a payment here to return an excess of tax revenue in the form of a fully universal payment. So I think that's some pretty exciting news. So I wanted to include that. The United States did 3 stimulus checks. We boosted our unemployment checks, and we did 6 months of essentially basic income for kids in the form of our enhanced child tax credit. I think that was a huge deal. And global inflation happened. And of course, that's a big part of the story as well. I want to point out that it maintained demand in a pandemic as we shifted from services to goods that had an impact on inflation. Supply chains had an impact. We had back-to-back oil shocks, early retirements, reduced immigration, profiteering, sickness, and deaths all happened as a result of COVID and everything, and also as a result of Putin and Russia. And so this global inflation story is definitely part of how we're going to be even going forward, trying to get basic income in the years ahead. Again, so pros for basic income that just happened is that people experience the safety net for the first time, and this is true all over the world. A lot of people felt maybe that their country had something there for them in case of emergencies, and they experienced what that was like firsthand. So I think that's actually positive for basic income, as people were extremely frustrated. They fell through the safety net. They didn't get help. They realized just how poorly designed the existing targeted safety net is. People also got to experience what it was like to kind of get a taste of basic income, where just money appeared in their bank accounts from the government. And I think that's something that's very helpful for people to just experience the normalcy of it. And again, here in the US, we cut child poverty in half between the stimulus checks and the child tax credit payments. We saw just how effective it is to reduce child poverty by just making sure that parents had money. And I think that changed some minds, and it showed even some more evidence of basic income in action, essentially. And also, as a result of the pandemic, we launched a bunch of different pilots in the US. And this is that the mayors launched this, and over 100 mayors have signed on to do this now. So there's a lot of activity now in the US as far as unconditional cash. So the cons for UBI as a result of what we just did and have seen, high inflation is an obstacle. Third round of stimulus checks was blamed. Third round of stimulus checks, because Biden did it, was blamed on Biden and the Democrats. So like if Trump had won the presidency and done a third round of stimulus checks, I'm sure like no conservative would probably be saying that stimulus checks caused inflation. But because we did the third round and because Biden did it, people love to say that stimulus checks are responsible for inflation here in the US, despite global inflation. Now, it's true that the stimulus checks probably did contribute in some way to the inflation that we're seeing. The Fed calculated that it may have been 3 percentage points of the 9% that it was at its peak for us here in the US. But that is, of course, even then, not the full story. And there's a lot more to learn from it. But in a simple story that people like to tell, people just want to blame it and say, oh, basic income caused inflation. So that's a challenge. And of course, the other thing is this shouting that, oh, no one wants to work anymore here in the US and also everywhere as a result of a labor shortage or insufficient wages. People just want to say, oh, the reason why labor markets are tight, the reason why it's hard to find people to work certain jobs is because of the stimulus payments. And so that's going to be a barrier going ahead too, is people just think for sure that that's what happened. So more about these basic income pilots have been launched in cities in the US. Began with 11 mayors in June of 2020, and now there's over 100 mayors. At least 48 pilots have launched so far, and there's many more in the planning stages. And it's also already inspired other unconditional cash programs that have nothing to do with mayors. These are city councils deciding to do it. These are governments at the county level deciding to do it. And these are even like nonprofits deciding, hey, well, maybe doing unconditional cash is something that can actually accomplish what we're attempting to accomplish already. And it could help us by just actually trying unconditional cash. So that's been an exciting development too. I think it's important. Some people look at the basic income pilots as being like, oh, that's not basic income. The way I look at it is that if we had a basic income, then you would see impacts on specific groups. So I think it's actually makes a lot of effective sense to be able to tell those stories of what happens to these specific groups. Because if you did, say, a big basic income pilot, maybe you would have like one or two homeless people or something as part of this if you had a fully random distribution. But this way we can say, well, what is the impact? If we just look at homeless people and we provide basic income to them, what is the impact? So here, the pilots actually have different focuses. It's give up for homeless, pregnant women, unpaid caregivers, former foster youth, high-risk youth, formerly incarcerated, Black mothers, Black fathers, COVID impacted, single parents, young parents, high school students, LGBTQ, artists, community college students, undocumented immigrants, refugees, pre-seniors, disabled, and welfare recipients. So these are, each of these kind of pilots have these different focus. And there's also various payment variants in the pilots too. So we're looking at different amounts, as low as $50 a week. The highest is $1,000 a month. We're looking at different distribution rates, so weekly, biweekly, monthly, semi-annually, and then different durations. The shortest is 6 months, the longest is 5 years. And there's even like some hybrids where they are combining, say, like an upfront cash lump sum combined with a monthly income as well. So I think there's just a lot that we can learn from everything that's going on here in the US right now. Here's some things that we already have learned. So the Stockton, California results came out pretty much soon after the pandemic started in 2020. Actually, it went through 2020 a little bit after. I think the results came out in late 2020, early 2021. Regardless, those were the first results of all the pilots in the US. And this was a $500 per month basic income. And they found that full-time employment among recipients was twice the rate of non-recipients. So this goes entirely against this belief that people will work less with a basic income. This actually increased the amount of employment among basic income recipients. And we also saw this happen in the Hudson pilot too. The second year results just came out like last week, this week. And again, this was a $500 per month basic income. The pilot's going on for 5 years, but the results after 2 years is that recipients have increased their employment by 72%. So we also learned what happens when a basic income is removed. This was something that I really thought was interesting, how the impact of letting the child tax payment expire actually resulted in decreased parental employment. So the theory is that parents lost the ability to afford childcare, and as a result of that, they needed to stay home instead of having a job. And so they actually had to quit their jobs, reduce their time at their jobs. And again, this goes right to, oh, people will stop working if they have a basic income. Well, we saw if you take away a basic income, it reduces work. And, the impact of UBI on work is actually something that we already have a lot of data on. And this is actually one of my favorite studies to share because it's a systematic review. It's a study of studies. And here's what from the study. Despite a detailed search, we have not found any evidence of a significant reduction in labor supply. Instead, we found evidence that labor supply increases globally among adults, men and women, young and old, and the existence of some insignificant and functional reductions to the system, such as a decrease in workers from the following categories: children, the elderly, the sick, those with disabilities, women with young children to look after, or young people who continued studying. These reductions do not reduce overall supply because it is largely offset by increased supply from other members of the community. So we often see, say, a high school student who would otherwise have to work, contribute to the family income, quit their job and focus on finishing high school. That is a result of basic income that we've seen. And does that mean that that job that they're no longer working goes unfilled? No, it means someone else who was unemployed and looking for a job now has that job. And yet, despite all of this, we saw that another issue here is, as a result of the pandemic, has been this labor shortage. And as a result of this too, I thought it was really interesting how the automation argument really fell out of favor temporarily, whereas people were saying, and like, they're making fun. And so here's one I included as far as a tweet about Andrew Yang. So Andrew Yang's whole shtick was the Davos nonsense idea that robots are going to take our jobs, so we need a universal basic income. A few years later, there's a massive labor shortage disproving Yang's whole theory. So he's moved on to third-party and crypto bro flexing. So this idea that, you know, oh, we're worried about automation, and yet now we don't actually have enough people for the jobs that we need, like, that's ridiculous. Like, how insane to even be talking about basic income when we don't have enough people doing work. And then all of a sudden, ChatGPT happened. The text-to-image AIs happened, like DALL-E 2, Mid-Journey, Stable Diffusion. And even more recently, there was a viral video of the opening of automated McDonald's in Texas. And then there's stuff around the corner too. And so here, they had been making fun of automation shortly for a short time. And now all of a sudden, it's like people are re-panicked about just what AI is capable of, because as we all know here, advancement of technologies can happen very quickly and just take people by surprise. So as a result of this too, we're already seeing artists against AI. We're seeing schools banning GPT, and GPT-4 is coming soon. So people who even think that are scared about ChatGPT now, or they've looked at it and said, it's not that big of a deal, it's still not going to do any replacing, GPT-4 is around the corner. And I think that that's going to cause quite a stir as well. So we also know that even just the fear of automation actually has an impact on health. So here's a study that I like to share. This is from the study using the 2012 and 2014 waves of the GSS. Employees in occupational classes at higher risk of automation reported more job insecurity. That in turn was associated with poor health. The 2SLS estimates show that a 10% increase in automation risk at county level is associated with a 2.38, 0.8, and 0.6 percentage point lower general, physical, and mental health, respectively. So even just being in danger of feeling that you're going to lose your job can actually have negative health impacts. We also see an impact of automation on democracy. So this is from the report, quote, "We investigate the impact of industrial robot adoption on individual voting behavior in 13 Western European countries between 1999 and 2015. We find that individuals more exposed to automation tend to display higher support for the radical right. Automation was also associated with poorer perceived economic conditions, lower likelihood of having a permanent contract, and lower satisfaction with government and democracy." I think this is really important, and part of the key story that we're seeing globally is that fear of automation and actual automating of employment is actually making society more extreme and more open to extremes and a loss of faith in democracy itself. Then there's also, what if we actually combined automation with UBI? So here's a report that looked at this. In our baseline scenario, automation has a moderate effect on regional outputs and a small effect on world interest rates. However, it has a major impact on inequality, both wage inequality within regions and per capita GDP inequality across regions. We examined two policy responses to technological change: mandating use of the advanced technology and providing universal basic income to share gains from automation. The former policy can raise a region's output, but at a welfare cost. The latter policy can transform the automation into a win-win for all generations in a region. Yeah, so this was a report just looking at what happens if we combine UBI with automation, and found that actually was a win-win. Whereas if you just automated without it, that you did actually have quite a amount of people who were worse off. And this is one of my favorite articles I've seen as a result. This came out in 2022. I think this is a really smart reframing as far as instead of fearing automation, that we actually need automation and we need to invest in automation to be more competitive against especially China in particular. But that we need to remove these barriers to automation, that if people are afraid of it, it's holding us back. We need to change that. So this is a quote from it that I like. UBI would strengthen American competitiveness on the world stage by unlocking support for the technological progress and AI development. As such, it would help the United States maintain its hegemonic advantage over China. UBI reframes the story of automation. Instead of replacing us, robots would now be working for us, and their progress would deliver us financial freedom. As their productivity grows in the coming decades, so could monthly checks, aka the dividends we are paid for being stakeholders in the United States. In this context, rapid technological progress that allows America to stay nationally competitive is not only digestible, but beneficial. So I want to make a specific point here too of this reframing, and pointing out that technology could increase our financial freedom. Because this is also something, this is a report that came out, actually it was the preprint came out a couple of years ago, and it was just published in a peer-reviewed experimental social psychology journal. But this was looking at messaging of UBI. And so here's what it found. Across these 3 online experiments with US adults, we found that communicating the novel policy features of UBI alone were not sufficient to achieve bipartisan support for UBI or overcome negative stereotyping of its recipients. However, when UBI was described as advancing the more conservative value of financial freedom, conservatives perceived the policy to be more aligned with their values and were less opposed to the policy. So framing basic income in terms of financial freedom can actually increase support, especially among conservatives. And this is actually a quote I want to include because it was central to Nixon's attempt for a guaranteed income in the 70s, where we came close. We passed it in our House twice, but it never passed the Senate. This actually was spoken from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and Nixon was there to hear it. And it was kind of actually like the basis of their close friendship and partnership after the fact. But this was the concern back in the late 60s, and it really reminds me of where we are again. Look, we are in a situation approaching anarchy. The confidence and trust in institutions, the necessary institutions holding together society, is dwindling, drying up. Liberals and conservatives have to come together to try to address people's real needs. Otherwise, the society is going to collapse. The social contract will go, and we won't have enough respect for institutions to keep going. So Daniel Moynihan was a Democrat, Nixon was a Republican. They figured that at the time, in a time of great social strife and upheaval, they really needed to focus on just meeting people's basic needs, and that was a bipartisan thing they needed to do. About this loss of trust, that again is where we're at. 6 in 10 now say their default is to distrust, and this is around the world. They distrust something until they see evidence is trustworthy. Government leaders are now the least trusted of all leaders, with only 42% trust. In many democracies, trust in institutions is no longer a majority of view, including the US at 43%. 85% of people fear the loss of their jobs. 48% believe government is now a divisive force. And in no developed country do most people feel they will be better off in 5 years. So again, I think this loss of trust is part and parcel with this rising automation, rising inequality, rising financial insecurity. And I say that too because here's a study that looked at the impact of targeted assistance on trust. So this is what happens when you target income. Among those who barely met the cutoff to be cash transfer recipients, the relative poverty prime led to a 0.6% point increase in government satisfaction. Among those who barely missed the cutoff and received no cash transfer assistance, we observe a 10.5 percentage point drop in government confidence. Non-beneficiaries feel resentment that they do not have access to economic assistance from the state that others have access to, despite their economic need. So when you look at that line, when you look at people who just barely qualify for something or barely don't qualify for something, if you barely qualify for help, you're going to look positively at the government. But if you barely don't qualify for help, if you feel that you need help and you're not getting it, you see a massive drop in government confidence. So I think that's what we're seeing, is that so many people feel that they need help, but they don't qualify for it. And on the flip side of this, we actually have seen the impact of unconditional basic income on trust. So this is one of the most, I think, interesting and important findings from the Finland experiment of basic income, is that at the end of 2 years, basic income recipients registered elevated levels of trust in other people and institutions, such as Finland's politicians saw a 13% increase, political parties, parliament, judiciary, and social security system. One explanation could be that the basic income experiment did not involve bureaucracy, another that the recipient felt society or the system was not neglecting people who had fallen on hard times. So again, when you actually trust people and show that unconditional trust and you actually get them help and they feel they need help, then that does increase societal trust. And I think that's loss of trust is a big part of the problem that we're seeing all around the world today. So I'm just going to just summarize these. This is a summary that I put together of a bunch of different already experiments that have been completed, trials, programs. These are sources of evidence for basic income in action. And so I like to point this out that there's a lot we already know. So even though there's a lot more stuff going on and people are saying, oh, we should test it, there's a pile of evidence already out there. And these are just a lot of the impacts that I've seen throughout all these experiments, some of the stuff that we know. So just go through these really quickly. Again, no significant reduction in labor supply. And in fact, we can see an increase. We often, this is like over and over again, I see increased self-employment among recipients of basic income. We see increases in part-time employment. We do not see an increase in alcohol and tobacco use. In fact, a meta-analysis of this shows a slight decrease across the board. And again, as far as people not working anymore, that one of those groups is new mothers. They extend their maternity leaves, and I would argue that that's, of course, work. We see birth rates improve due to better maternal nutrition. Those have lifelong health impacts to have better birth weights. Graduation rates and educational outcomes improve. So this actually makes investments in education go further. Hospitalization rates decline. We see improvements in health. So this means that we could actually, countries could spend less money on their healthcare systems with a healthier population. Crime goes down. That's a repeated finding over and over. We see crime go down. In the Namibia UBI pilot, it went down as far as 42%. And there's specific crimes that I think are really signals of absolute desperation that people don't want to do. I think illegal hunting is one of those because that dropped by 95% in Namibia when with the UBI pilot. Repeatedly, domestic violence decreases. Again, trust increases, homeownership rates increase, food security increases. People actually eat healthier, they eat more fruits and vegetables. We see improved cognitive functioning, improved personality traits, and savings go up and debts go down often. So that's the summary of what we already know. And then there's also stuff that that isn't even looking specifically at basic income, but I think actually has a lot to tell us about basic income, and is an example of cognitive studies. So if you look at, what happens before or after harvest, and you see like a decrease in or an increase in perceived tested IQ when people have this feeling of financial security. And you can actually create experiments where you reduce a feeling of financial security by making people think about money and making payments, and you have that same effect of loss of IQ. So just imagine, like, there's this burden on people's minds that's happening because of this constant feeling of not being able to pay their bills, this economic insecurity, just focused on survival. And so if we get beyond that, if we actually lift people out of this, then we can see this improved cognitive functioning due to reducing this cognitive taxation on people's minds. So here's what I'm most excited about in the immediate future as far as UBI pilots and the potential for like the global conversation. So a lot of people don't know that OpenAI has actually had a 5-year UBI pilot in the works here in the US. I think that's gonna, not only is it 1,000 people over 5 years and $1,000 per month, so this is a big pilot, but also the fact that OpenAI is behind it, that Sam Altman is behind it. So this is, the same people behind ChatGPT. They'll be able to, this can be like combined together. People say, oh, well, look at what ChatGPT is doing, but also look what they looked at. And it shows that basic income, can potentially make a huge difference as far as technology working for us instead of against us. Catalonia is starting a UBI pilot here this year. It's going to be 5,000 people over 2 years, 800 euros a month. So that's going to be a really impressive pilot. I'm really excited about that. They're going to have a saturation site. They're really focused on universality. They're only excluding the top 10% richest, and the logic is sound too. They're saying that, well, the top 10% are going to be net payers into the system anyways. So there's no reason to provide to them as part of a pilot. And instead, it's going to go to the bottom 90%. It's going to be random. So you'll be able to see not only the impact on the poor, but the middle class as well. And I think that's going to be a great pilot. Germany has a small UBI pilot that actually ends next year, but the amount is actually $1,200 a month, so 1,200 euros a month. So that's one of the larger amount pilots, 3 years. I'm excited about those results and what that's going to do. Specifically in Germany, and I'll cover Germany a bit here later. Wales UBI pilot ends in 2025. That's actually the largest amount of basic income in a pilot, so I'm excited about that. 500 people for 3 years, and Ireland's doing a UBI pilot ends in 2025. 2,000 people, 3 years, 325 per week. So this is a per week pilot. And I think that's going to be really interesting in Ireland too, because they actually, this is focused on artists in Ireland, and they even want to like make that permanent potentially as well. And same with Wales, that's focusing on care leavers, so foster youth leaving care, and that could be permanent as well. So what about like, where are we at right now across the world? Here's a poll of EU countries. And as you can see, Germany has the strongest support for basic income. Again, because the pilot ending soon and because of the strong support, I think Germany is a really interesting potential first country to do basic income. And not only is it popular there, but as you can see also in this other question, in the same polling, it's actually Germany who is most, has the strongest belief that actually they afford a basic income. So not only do they really like it, but they also feel it's the most realistic that they can do it versus any other country that also likes it. So Germany, I think, is really interesting for basic income in the years ahead. Also, South Korea came very close to a basic income. They had a presidential election, and the UBI candidate just barely lost. He got 48% of the vote. And one of the reasons why there's so much activity and support for basic income in Korea is that they actually already have a basic income for youth program. So those who turn 24 start receiving a basic income for that year. And that has helped grow support and interest. And they also, this is something a lot of people don't know, but they actually have an active UBI experiment too. They're doing it in a rural area, providing $120 a month to 4,000 people for 5 years. So this is an actual UBI experiment, and they're focusing on a rural area, which I think is really interesting compared to, say, an urban area. And they already immediately saw results they liked from the rural areas. So they're already planning to expand the UBI trial to 4 more rural areas. And they also not only have that UBI pilot going, but they're actually testing negative income tax too. So this is, they're providing an amount at the household level instead of individuals, and they're doing it with a 50% phase out rate like negative income taxes usually do, so that they can actually compare the impact between UBI and a negative income tax variant. And they're also this year going to start paying a basic income to parents of newborns for the first 2 years of life for $740 per month. So there's just a lot going on in South Korea. So even though the presidential candidate lost, I think there's a lot of potential there. And also another country I think people need to know about is Brazil. So the story here is that Brazil actually passed the basic income into law in 2004, but they left it up to the executive to execute. So that's never been done. A president has never actually put basic income into action, even though it's they could at any time. And they just had a new presidential election, and Lula won. And Lula is on record as saying that he would implement Brazil's UBI law if he won. And he now describes UBI as an international necessity. So it's possible that Lula could actually, at any moment, decide to implement basic income in Brazil. They wouldn't have to vote on it. He could just do it. So that's a really interesting place for the future of basic income as well. Here's some things about my own thinking as a result of COVID and everything. I think that possibly one of the biggest challenges about winning basic income is this universality versus targeting. I was just kind of amazed that even in like total panic mode, where we really did not know who was most in need, because I mean, to determine need, we're looking at that tax results from years prior to the pandemic, and yet we still couldn't do universality. We couldn't do universality. We couldn't do a universal payment and then tax back from those who ended up earning more. Instead, we had to means test it. So it really is a challenge to get people to see the value of universality. Part of the reason why that's such a challenge too, I think, comes down to people's belief about money, taxes, deficits, and the national debt. I think that people really want to spend as little money as possible because of the way that they feel about money and taxes and deficits and the debt. And so they're just not as open as they would otherwise be if they better understood it about why combining basic income with taxation just makes far more sense than trying to means test something. I'm also very concerned that as a result of the pandemic, conspiracy circles now really see basic income as being part of a World Economic Forum conspiracy of the elites to control people. There's a lot of talk about UBI being a trick, and it'll be through central bank digital currencies, and it'll be all about controlling people. That's again also why I have always stressed unconditionality as the most important aspect of the definition of basic income, and is also why I make sure and usually refer to UBI as unconditional basic income instead of universal basic income, just to stress the unconditionality. But this lack of understanding of what UBI is I think helping people to see it as some kind of conspiracy of control instead of actual loss of control among the elites and freedom for people to actually make their own decisions and be free from those who would wish to control them. I think another barrier going forward is that people can really believe that UBI was tested. They can look at the stimulus checks in the US and say the CERB in Canada. They can look at what governments did and say, oh, look, they tried it and it caused inflation and a labor shortage. So basic income just doesn't work. I think that's going to be this barrier, getting people to understand what UBI is, what we did in the pandemic that wasn't basic income. That's a challenge. And I also think that we really do need to focus on enhancing and improving democracy to win UBI. And these things back each other up. It's kind of catch-22. As I mentioned previously, we have this like loss of faith in democracy due to financial insecurity. It's just that much more of a challenge where we need to actually strengthen democracy and strengthen government, which is a challenge where people feel less and less trust in governments. And we need to implement things like ranked choice voting and nonpartisan primaries, things that increase bipartisanship and increase collaboration, instead of continuing with ways of increasing partisanship and making it harder and harder for parties to work together and for people to think about actual policy instead of just thinking about what their people in their party or their parties like or don't like. And what I just want to mention is what I'm really excited about as far as a new option, a new program, a new future coming up that I think will have an impact on the basic income movement is something I'm advising on too, called Commingle. And so this is going to be this will be an app that creates a community where people can actually contribute 7% of their incomes automatically. And on a weekly basis, everyone will receive the same amount every week in return. So it's essentially like a voluntary flat income tax, small UBI that can be launched immediately. And I think that if people start experiencing what it feels like to receive a small basic income on a weekly basis and to actually opt into it and just have that feeling and will help a lot. And I think it also, the fact that everyone's contributing and everyone's receiving will also help people better understand what UBI is. That it's not just that, you know, you would spend money via taxes and not get anything back, that everyone gets something back and everyone puts in something. It's just there's different net payers and net recipients. And just want to end with this chart. I know everyone here is familiar with this chart, but I think that something like this is important to think about because it's you know, prediction, you know, versus you know, where we're going as far as if it's you know, a law or not, or if it's just something that's happening. So when it comes to you know, Moore's law, you know, I see it like it's not like some natural law. It's a more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's that people involved, the engineers, the companies, people working on this, they want it to be true that that this law is true and is maintained. So it's like they pick a goal, and we've been working towards that, and because that's a goal, that we're achieving that goal. And I think that that's how we need to look at technology in general. That, you know, if we want to make technology work for us, you know, we can't just assume that basic income was going to happen. You know, another prediction was made decades ago as far as we'd all be working like 10-hour weeks now, but we didn't get there. Well, why? We didn't look at it as like this goal. We just like thought it would happen, and, you know, we didn't make it happen. So if we're going to actually make technology work for all of us, then that's something that we actually have to put work into doing. And that's why I put my work into basic income, because we actually have to make it happen. It's not going to happen on its own. And here's just something I made with Midjourney to help show this. So I work for you now, human. Here's my paycheck. This is, you know, just the idea made real of technology actually working for all of us. that that's the way that things should be, and we can make it that way. Thank you all for listening. Here's my information, my website. You can find me on Twitter, it's where I'm most active, and my email. Thank you.
Many thanks, Scott. You've given us a great deal to think about. There are lots of questions bubbling up. Let's pick an easy one first, perhaps. The sources that you're quoting, are there links available on your website so that people can look in more detail? For example, Rebecca Byrne is particularly interested in the tests for improved cognitive functioning. You mentioned 43% cognitive functioning. So if somebody does have an interest in a particular study, can they find the links on your website?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to find the sources is to I have like a mega thread on my Twitter account, and so that way, like, each thing is separate. So if you want to find the source for a particular thing, you can go through that thread and you can find that particular thing, and you'll find the link there for that.
Thanks. Now there's questions about the pilots, and there's a suggestion which I sympathize with, that the limited nature of the pilots means that it's hard to truly understand the full implications of UBI. So Gennady Stolarov says, well, because people know they are time limited, they're not really going to live in the way they would live in the long term if there was more money coming. So to an extent, the pilots might be understating the long-term positive effects. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there's the question that because they're relatively small, they're relatively affordable. And it's easy to see that if people are given money, then on the whole, their lives will be better. That's no surprise. But if this was to be scaled up to a whole region or even to a whole country, then they're going to require much more taxation or some other funding, and more people, the ones who are currently sort of okay with their current level of taxation, might get very resentful and distrust the whole system. So what's your view on how we can extrapolate from the trials to how things might be in the larger scale?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions in that one question. Let's see, try to break these down one by one. Yeah, first of all, there's definitely some long-term stuff that we know. I think Alaska is always good to point to as far as what has been the result of a fully universal dividend on an annual basis since 1982. And like part of this is we've seen the increased employment. We've seen a study looked at this, saw the increased part-time employment. This is also one of those where we see the improved birth weights, and we've seen like reduced obesity, child obesity, especially as a result of this. Like there's a lot of positive impacts on this long-term thing where people definitely expect it to keep coming and don't expect it to stop. And also there's another really long-term thing as a result of the Cherokee dividend in North Carolina. And that's actually an amount that's really equivalent to basic income. Now it's as high as maybe over $1,000 per equivalent to over $1,000 per month now, but paid quarterly, I think. That also shows very long-term positive impacts, including actually increased voter participation, so that like kids who grew up in basic income households are more engaged citizens. I think that's again a really important point for improved democracy through that. So those are some long-term things that are out there. As far as like funding stuff, I think that people really overestimate just how much marginal taxation is required in order to make basic income possible at an amount that people really consider to be an effective amount. I think so. To describe that, you know, we first of all, we already have a lot of tax subsidies and expenditures. We already reduce people's taxes for various reasons. We could easily just make that into the basic income, you know, amount. Think of it as like a universal refundable credit instead of these various subsidies and deductions. And I think part of the problem too, where people like feel that government isn't helping them, even though that they are getting some assistance. So like, let's say you'll have people receiving a home mortgage interest rate deduction. And they'll look at people receiving a housing voucher and be like, why is it that they get help for housing and I don't? Even though that they're actually getting this tax credit because of owning a house. And so basic income, I think part of the value of it is making sure that these invisible forms of assistance, these invisible expenditures are actually made visible. And when we do that, you don't have to adjust, taxes at all. You're just replacing these various expenditures with the basic income and saying, this is what you're getting. You're not getting nothing. I also think that there's an underestimate of just how impactful basic income will be on existing expenditures. So as I mentioned, as far as evidence goes, that you make education go further with basic income, that you make healthcare, there's less requirements for healthcare spending when you have a healthier population. And so if you have a healthier population, I think you're going to see reduced spending on things like national healthcare. And when you see that, then you actually don't have to adjust tax rates because you're already spending so much money treating the impacts of poverty. And that if you decrease those impacts, that you're going to be able to shift that spending elsewhere. And that's the basic income. So I think there's a lot of savings there as well. And then I'd also mention that part of the issue of people thinking that basic income requires it's like so expensive and requires such like tax rates is not seeing basic income as being a net transfer. If you think of basic income as the cost calculation as being, oh, well, you take the amount of UBI and you multiply it by everyone in a country, that's hugely expensive. But that's not the way that it actually works because, again, everyone is receiving it, but everyone's paying it too. So if you look at that one person who happens to be receiving $1,000 a month in basic income and their taxes increased by $12,000 in order to make the basic income possible, then the cost for that person is zero because they're essentially paying for their own basic income. There is no tax increase on them. They're actually not even, paying that tax. It's just a zero. So what really matters is determining the difference between what people are paying more in taxes and what people are receiving in the basic income. And that amount across the population is the cost of basic income. And that, depending on the amount of basic income and the taxes to do it, it's usually around, say, like a third of what people think of as the required total cost of a basic income. So basic income was a lot cheaper than people think that it is when you calculate it correctly and understand it as being both a combination of a tax and a payment instead of just the payment itself.
How do you react to the suggestion made by, for example, Andreas Kasparevicius, who says this sounds very much like communism? And people who grew up or who have relatives who lived in the Soviet Union days, they know that fine-sounding egalitarian theories of redistribution of resources to everybody leads to actually a much worse setup.
Yeah, so I like to point out that that Alaska is not a communist utopia. So again, Alaska is really the only place that the UBI has existed in practice again since 1982. So no one who receives a dividend in Alaska thinks of this as communism or socialism. They think of it as their fair share as owners of Alaska's natural resources in the form of oil. So this is just a universal floor of money. And of course, money is needed for markets. And so, this is not about state ownership of resources. This is not about owning the means of production. This is not about like workers taking over. This is really just about making sure that everyone has some money to spend into private markets. And this is also why, considered to be the godfathers of free market, neoliberal economics, Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek both supported basic income. So, no one looks at Milton Friedman as being as a communist because of his support for basic income. He also, people don't know that he saw basic income and negative income tax as two ways of going about the same thing. He approved of both of them. I also argue that the basic income actually makes markets work better. It leads to higher functioning markets. I think one of the issues with markets, especially as a result of automation, is that markets can't tell the difference between people not having the money for something and people not wanting to spend their money on that something. So let's say, you've got let's say an ice cream shop is open. So someone has a great idea for ice cream, they open it, and people love it, but there's like the customers fall off and they have to close their doors. And so the question is, did they close their doors because people didn't like their ice cream, or is it because people just lost the ability to have that extra income to spend on ice cream? And so if you make sure that everyone has at least some money to spend in markets, that at least like essentially some voting power to vote on what businesses should be open, what goods and services should be made and what shouldn't, then you're not going to have like a high functioning market mechanism for what should and shouldn't be a functioning business. And also, basic income functions as both venture capital for would-be business starters and also, again, consumer demand. So a business that people have an idea for, they're more able to start because of basic income. And then they're also more likely to be successful if people like it, because people being able to spend their money at that business. So basic income is extremely important, I would argue, to capitalism, especially going forward as automation eats away people's ability to spend. You have to make sure that there's a dividend for people, and that's how to essentially, save capitalism from eating itself. And so if people love capitalism, you should really be interested in basic income.
Thanks. I say to the audience, I encourage you to have a look in the Q&A window. Listen, of course, to what Scott's saying, but if you've got a little bit of bandwidth, tick some upvotes to the questions you think, hey, that's particularly good. And I'm going to take the question at the top of the list now by Gordon Silverman, who is concerned about the opposition to basic income from the charts you showed, Scott, which surprisingly to him showed some Scandinavian countries, I think Sweden and Denmark, with considerable public opposition to UBI. So what's your thinking as to what's going on there?
Yeah, I've had some talks with people from the Nordic states about this, and I think what's happening there is that they have really strong safety nets as is, and they're targeted. Maybe some things could be universal, so like it's not unheard of for universal child allowance to exist. But there is this belief that, oh well, we don't need that. Like everything's working great. We don't need to think about changing something in a big way. And I think that it's kind of funny how you would assume that maybe because they're so close to basic income, that maybe by tweaking some things, that you could make something fully universal, that you could reduce the targeting, and that you'd have basic income. But it's almost like because they're so close, they're almost further away from doing it. So I'm not closed off. I think that it's certainly possible that that a Nordic state could surprise us by doing it. But yeah, like as far as like public sentiment, there is that there's just loss of support due to just this firm belief that they have a strong safety net as is. And I would also add too that I think part of this is you see kind of a hesitance to support basic income among unions. This is something that you see worldwide too, and I always find that frustrating because as I just said, basic income was important to capitalism, but I would also argue that basic income was important to workers in the labor movement, especially again going forward with automation. Basic income provides everyone the power to say no, and that means that when it comes to a job that has insufficient pay or work conditions, that you can say no. So you have bargaining power outside of unions. I think that's really important for the labor movement. I also think it's important for covering every worker, because not every job can actually realistically have a union, and not every form of work can have a union. So if you look at like unpaid care workers, they should be able to say no. They should have bargaining power too, but they don't. And then it also strengthens unions. So, if right now unions need to have dues in order to afford strikes, and then let's say you have this union fund and they calculate that they can handle paying each of their workers, say $1,000 a month for 6 months in order to strike, and they can't go beyond that. So they need to win their demands within, let's say, 6 months. Basic income is, of course, this unlimited permanent strike fund. So unions could last as long as they wanted to. You would actually have a stronger union as a result of basic income and the ability to win your demands in a way that isn't possible now. And you would also make it possible to even do like general strikes in a way that we've never seen. That potential would be opened up for people to do a general strike in a way that doesn't exist otherwise. So yeah, like UBI is really important to labor unions, but for some reason, we see that labor unions often oppose basic income. There's a debate to be had there about why that is, like maybe a fear of a loss of personal relevance for someone high in the union, that basic income would somehow make unions no longer necessary. I think that's partly part of it, but fact remains that as long as the labor movement, as long as labor unions are critical and think of basic income negatively, then countries where unions have a lot of sway are potentially going to be less likely to adopt basic income.
Well, following on from that, there are people who think there should be a strengthening of the social safety net, who are worried about the precariat, but they argue against UBI, universal basic income, and say instead we should have universal basic resources or universal basic services. So this is a question from PNJ. Some nations provide free education, local transport, healthcare. Shouldn't we consider that? And I did notice this morning there's a TED talk that's just been released by British journalist Aaron Bastani, who is well known as a thoughtful critic from the left. He runs Novara Media, and he said in there, look, universal basic income, if it's affordable, it's not significant. If it's significant, it's not affordable. And he argues, let's do what we're doing in Britain already, strengthen the free to use healthcare system, make housing more affordable and free, make transport green transport as opposed to polluting transport more widely available, and of course education free to everyone. How do you assess the claims of UBS against UBI?
Yeah, I don't see these things as antagonistic ideas. I really like to stress that UBI is this fully unconditional universal floor. By a floor, it makes sure that no one ever falls through it, and then it reaches everybody. And universal basic services, no matter how universal that they aren't going to reach everybody just as a function of realism. As an example of that, let's say universal transport. What do you mean by universal transport? In a city, that we can understand that, like making subways free, making buses free. Sure, that makes sense. But then what about universal transport, like in a highly rural area? What does that mean? Well, right now, really, in order to make it possible, it would be like cars for everybody, or you'd have to either make sure everyone has a car, or even if you did something like free Uber or something in a rural area, that's not realistic either. So if you just make sure that people have money, then they can choose for themselves, their favorite method of transport. They could actually buy a used car. They could buy an e-bike. They could make their own choices. And they would not be excluded. Whereas if you focused on universal services, you would have people being excluded from this in certain areas. And I also think that, again, I really like to stress this foundational aspect and in the relation to, say, universal education and universal healthcare. So, we absolutely need universal education, universal healthcare, but absent basic income, we're actually investing money into education and seeing worse outcomes, because students, let's say you go to school hungry, and you're studying at home, but your family is stressed out. Your parents are unable to like help with your schoolwork because they're busy with like 2 or 3 jobs, or they're like stressed out and fighting with each other. So you don't have a conducive to school environment for doing homework at home. Like there's all sorts of reasons why the money we're putting in education is falling short, because we're not investing in actual people at the direct level with resources for food, housing, and the security and meeting their own choices and needs on their own. And then with healthcare, same thing, where if we have that floor, then we're going to be spending less on healthcare. But if you don't do that, if you just say, oh, let's just focus on healthcare, great, but you're going to be spending more on healthcare because you're going to be treating all these results of lack of basic income in a much more expensive way downstream than you would otherwise. So, great, let's reduce homelessness with housing first policies. Let's actually treat and have healthcare. Let's have education. But we want to make sure that we're avoiding a lot of these problems that we're treating with these services. And if you make sure that people have the unconditional income first as the starting point, as this foundation, then all these investments in services go further, that the services themselves work better, they're more efficient, and have better outcomes. So don't just choose one or the other. Don't just have basic services or basic income. Just make sure that you have that foundation, and that you do make sure to make the investments on top of that.
There's a question by Patty O'Callaghan about, can this be applied equally, your UBI ideas, can it be applied equally in different countries? It might work in US if there's relatively robust economy there, she suggests, but the risk is that it might not work elsewhere. There might even be more inequality. And there's also the question of people in other countries might try to migrate to the US and so on in order to pick up a universal basic income.
Yeah, it's funny how you can have this argument of, oh, it'll work in rich countries only, or oh, it'll only work in undeveloped countries only, or oh, people behave differently in one or the other. Like there's certainly different ways of going about basic income, let's say in optimal ways, depending on the country and the economic circumstances. But I would argue that any country could actually do it. I just think that there's maybe different best ways of going about it. I think that let's say a lot of countries are rich in resources, but those resources aren't benefiting everybody. If you had like the Alaska model situation where, let's say in some place like somewhere in South Africa, where there's resources, but it's what's happening is those resources are being mined by external companies. They're lining the pockets of local politicians and power brokers, and it's making some people very rich, but it's not making the people of that country very rich, or even reducing poverty. So I think part of this needs to be recognizing that we should be looking at resources more in the term of like Alaska does, where you actually make sure that you have some kind of dividend on those resources instead of just certain people getting wildly wealthy, and making sure that that wealth is more shared with the people who I would argue are more rightful owners, co-owners of that natural resource than others. And there's always an amount too. Like, so you could, in a rich country, certainly you could do a higher amount based on massive productivity, especially via more automation. versus a less developed country with less technology and wider unemployment, where you might have to have a lower UBI amount, but the fact remains that by having this universal floor underneath people, that again, you would actually help people to start their own businesses, for those businesses to succeed. And that's why, in UBI pilots, let's say, where you look at something like India or Namibia, where you see massive self-employment impacts. In Namibia, self-employment quadrupled as a result of the Namibia basic income. And I don't think we're going to see anywhere near that impact on self-employment and entrepreneurship in, say, the US. But I do think that we will still see it. There was some polling done in the US that looked at this, I thought was pretty indicative of this, which was that you could see this difference in breakdown between demographics. So people who were asked if you would start a business with basic income, white respondents, I think it was 3%, said that they would use the money to start their own business. So some people would. And you looked at Black respondents, and it was about a third. So I think there's a difference in access to capital, this feeling of risk aversion. And so if you're barely getting by, if you don't have the resources to start a business, and you start getting basic income, then you're much more likely to start a business. Whereas if you already have access to capital and you want to start a business, maybe you're more likely to have already started one. But there's still this risk aversion potential where you may be worried about failing and what that impact would have. But the impact is going to be much greater on people who have a lack of access to money currently. So that's why I think in a country with high unemployment and that's less developed, you're going to see basic income really kickstart the market there and development there. And you're going to see a lot more of a multiplier effect in these countries. And so you may start smaller, but I think you could actually grow the basic income quicker over time versus a more developed country. We can start higher, but maybe it's going to grow more slowly depending on the amount of automation that you put into it.
We've time perhaps for a small number of other questions. The one with the most votes is back on the question of how can this be paid for? You've given some answers to that already, saying that it isn't as expensive in some sense as people expect. But Gennady Stolarov suggests, well, rather than thinking just about raising money by taxes to pay for this, what about just taking advantage of resources that exist? So leasing government publicly owned land and getting returns on that. You've mentioned the benefits, the revenues from oil. So to what extent do you think we should be exploring more raising money from resources? To what extent do you think the answer lies in taxation? And to what extent do you think the answer lies in the ideas explored in your own recent book, Let There Be Money, which is, in a sense, governments can sometimes expand the money in circulation and, in the right circumstances, avoid inflation arising as a result?
Yeah, so obviously this is one of the biggest questions, is always about cost. I really like to just point out first, again, that what we're doing right now isn't costless. It's not free to not have a basic income. Avoiding paying a basic income actually costs quite a lot of money. I like to point out that here in the US, it's been calculated that we're spending over $1 trillion a year on the downstream costs of child poverty. So it's extremely expensive to not invest in your country's kids. And it's been multiple papers have looked at, what is the potential ROI of various child allowances, making sure that every kid actually has essentially a basic income. And the most recent one I saw was 10 to 1. And so, we could have actually, if we had continued our enhanced monthly child tax credit, if we had continued providing, it was around $250 to $300 per month, depending on the age of the kid, per kid here in the US, that would have cost an additional $100 billion per year. And that cut child poverty in half. So what are we doing spending $1 trillion a year when we could be spending $100 billion a year to actually spend a lot less overall? So I really want people to consider that poverty, insecurity, inequality, chronic stress, all of these things are extremely, extremely expensive. And basic income is actually an investment in avoiding those massive costs. And then when it comes to like the nitty gritty, again, people miscalculate the cost of basic income. It's a lot less than people understand it. You have to look at the net cost and not the gross cost. So once you see it as the net cost, it certainly becomes more understandable and more possible and more realistic to those who understand it. And then I would also say that, as far as my book goes, Let There Be Money, we exist, or many countries have a fiat money system. So this is that the countries actually create the money through the spending, and then taxation pulls money out of the economy. In a fiat money system, with a country with its own currency, taxes aren't funding government. Governments are actually just creating the money, and then taxes are pulling the money out. It's essentially erasing money. It's not some kind of like connected circle flow where taxes actually enable governments to spend. It's just that governments are spending and then taxes are erasing the money. So when you see it that way, then it's not to say that we can spend however, amount of money that we want. It's not that you can spend $10 trillion a year and that there's no impact. It's just that money itself is not the thing you should be focusing on. What matters is the amount of natural resources in the country. What matters is the amount of people, the amount of workers, the level of skill of those workers, the level of knowledge and the level of technology in that economy. Like, these are the things that really matter. And so when you recognize what really matters as far as like the resources and the economic capacity to actually say meet everyone's needs through a basic income, then you can design a better basic income. You focus on, all right, so what are the taxes that we would want not to fund the basic income, but in order to better align incentives? What are the activities and human behaviors that we would like to disincentivize through a tax, and what would we like to incentivize as an alternative to avoiding, that tax? So though I think that, like a carbon tax, I think is really smart as far as pairing with a basic income. If you do like a revenue neutral kind of carbon tax where you tax you tax carbon, and then you have a fully universal distribution of a dividend, that's the kind of policy that reduces carbon usage, reduces carbon footprints. The money that people get, it enables them to make greener choices. They're going to say spend less money on gas, and maybe they're going to get like an e-bike. They're going to walk more. Like, you incentive the economy at the individual level across like millions and billions of decisions to actually think about this in terms of, how do I actually spend less on the carbon tax and keep more of the dividend that I'm getting? And so, you reduce poverty, you reduce inequality as a result of if we taxed carbon footprints and provided people a basic income in return. So I think a carbon tax makes all the sense in the world to pair with a basic income. Land value taxes, I think, are also really smart. I also like the idea of like an automated payment tax. So this would be like a really small tax on like every market transaction. You could actually automate it through the banks. So every time you actually spend money on something, that a small amount is essentially deleted from the economy. That's the kind of way that you handle inflation in a smarter way, instead of trying to figure out, oh, well, let's actually tax something first in order to pay something or fund something. We aren't limited by that. What really matters is is going about taxes in a smart way, going about spending in a smart way. And I think basic income is pivotal at get to that, because again, it's this foundation. So if you have this foundation underneath everybody, you're going to be, let's say, I think, less likely to create bullshit jobs. This goes to David Graeber's bullshit jobs theory. I always, suggest that people, if you haven't read the book, read it. If you don't want to read the book, he's actually the essay it's based off of. It's a great essay. Just read that. Just to shorten what this is, it's just this idea that there's a lot of unnecessary work going on, that this work doesn't need to exist, but people are doing it because they need the money. People are doing it for whatever reasons, but it's unnecessary. So the definition of a bullshit job is that the people themselves feel that the job is entirely unnecessary. And so just think about what that means. Like, if you have a huge percentage of the population spending their hours doing unnecessary work, then that's actually hurting productivity. It's actually hurting the amount of how productive that country could be if everyone was actually doing something productive. So David Graeber concluded in his book that really the best way to eliminate bullshit jobs, to eliminate this unnecessary work, is to provide people with unconditional income, so they could choose for themselves what is unnecessary and what's necessary, what is good work, what is something that's valuable. And they could even do unpaid work versus paid work, that you could actually choose to be productive for free because your resources enable you to pursue that work. And I think that when it comes to maximizing productivity in order to, maximizing, the inflationary cost of a basic income, then basic income really drains out those unnecessary work. And that means that it makes that basic income more possible and, let's say, cheaper from the expense of, from this view of total resource usage. We want to reduce the amount of resources that we're using. It's not about money, it's about actual economic capacity.
I'm going to encourage people to find your book, Let There Be Money, which is available on Amazon. It's also available on your podcast, where you read it all out. It's one rather lengthy episode. I found it thought-provoking, and it addresses the point that you raised in your list of 5 major challenges, 5 complications, which is that there isn't a good understanding in society about money, taxes, deficits, and the national debt. So how have people responded to the ideas in that book, the advocacy for the Pigouvian taxes, and named after Arthur Pigou, the 1920s Cambridge economist, that taxes should be used in part to discourage socially unproductive behavior? So how has the reaction been generally to this direction you're steering yourself in more recently?
Yeah, for those who have read it, it's very, very positive. And then, I've only gotten like a very small handful of people who've read it who was like, this is garbage. But that's self-selective too. If you're already like a fan of my work, you're more likely to read the book. You're already more likely to agree with what I'm talking about, and then so you're more likely to really agree with the book. But it's funny, the book itself too is just a long article of mine. I just wanted to make sure that more people read it, because it's so long that I think a lot of people weren't reading it. And so I thought, maybe if it's just like a really small book, then more people will read it who otherwise wouldn't have. And same with like the audio version. Again, like you got to meet people where they are. So some people consume information in different ways. I think it's really part of the challenge as far going forward, getting people, I think, to understand money differently. Like here in the U.S., we just hit our debt ceiling like yesterday, and it's being weaponized. There's this threat that we won't that will default on our Treasury securities, and of course, if we did that, it would have massive implications to the world economy, because of just how many people rely on the full faith and credit of the US. So if we were to just voluntarily choose to not pay something where we create the money to pay it, it's just completely ridiculous that we could do that. But as long as people like think about like even the national debt as being like what it's called. You think of the national debt as being like, oh, it's just like household debt. So, I'm not going to spend money that I don't have. And so it kind of has that like this common sense kind of feel to it, and it's called the national debt. But that's not actually what it is. I mean, this is really a more like government created assets, where these are securities that we choose to create because they're so popular. And we do it because of this, the reasoning is that, well, if we're going to run a deficit, then we've inflated the money supply. So let's say, freeze that money by incentivizing people to lock money up, and then they'll do it because they'll earn interest on it. Like, that's this kind of belief. But it's not like we're not owing somebody for this, in the sense that like, say, China is like, going to choose to just like sell all of their securities, and it would like massively impact us. Like, it's not the way that it works. That we just choose to match deficits with securities. They're very popular. They don't fund government. We're actually just spending the money, and we just choose to do that at the same time. And as long as people think that it's just like the household budget, that it's just like household debt, we will have these issues where we think, oh, we can't spend money on that. We have to stop spending money. We've got to cut spending. We've got to go down the austerity road. Let's actually reduce Social Security. Let's cut this back. Like, all these harms that come from people thinking that like money is this like limited resource, instead of focusing on what is our economic capacity, how do we actually make the economy most productive, and part of that is automation. So here we are fearing automation and fearing that it's going to take jobs, when what we should be doing is saying, let's be as productive as possible. Let's automate as much work as we can. Let's eliminate as much unnecessary work as we can, so that we become maximally productive, and we could raise the amount of basic income. We could do other things with it too. We could have more services. We could do more things in a way that is better for people, instead of the situation we're in, where we feel like there's the scarcity, of everything, the scarcity mentality, the scarcity of, we can't do this or that because we don't have enough money. How do we pay for it? Like, we've got to get out of that thinking.
I'll come back to you in a minute, Scott, for some closing words, perhaps about your work with Humanity Forward or the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity. But let me briefly share some news as to what's happening next in London Futurists. Let me stop my video briefly. So this is what's coming next. A week's time from today, a discussion about another aspect of AI, which is how can we avoid the harms of AI? What kind of regulation should be put in place without damaging all the good, innovative opportunities that might arise, such as Scott was just mentioning, using AI to help solve all kinds of productivity issues, improving healthcare and so forth. So how do we regulate AI better? The EU has an AI Act under discussion, which will have worldwide significance. It's not just going to be restricted in its influence to the EU, and not everybody likes it. And one of its critics, a thoughtful critic, is our speaker in 7 days' time. After another 7 days, we are coming to the subject of, why do people believe dangerously false beliefs? And it's not just a matter of how clever people are. It's not just a matter of people having psychological issues, which lead them to cling inadvertently to unproductive, dangerous views. There are social aspects to this, which will be the subject of our session in 2 weeks' time by Caelan O'Connor, a philosopher of science, the co-author of the book you can see here, Misinformation Age. If you want to get more from London Futurists before then, I'll just briefly draw your attention again to some of our podcast episodes recently. This page shows, I think, the last 14 such episodes, and you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. These episodes typically last 30 minutes or so, so they're quite easy to digest. Having said that, let's turn on my video again. Scott, thanks so much for leading us through some very important findings. Your research is truly useful. What would you like our audience to have in their minds as they depart?
Departing thoughts is just, think what a basic income how a basic income would impact you. What would you do with an unconditional basic income? What are you not doing because you don't have it? What would it enable you to do? How would it impact your friends and family? How is it that you would impact you specifically? I think it's easier to think about really the potentials of it if you think about it personally for you, because I think a lot of people think about it negatively for others. If you ask a group of people, a room full of people, how many people they think would stop working if they had a basic income, like most people raise their hands, and you ask people, those same people, if they would stop working, and then like nobody raises their hands. So just think about it personally and think of the potential, and just consider how different things could be. And also, again, a great resource is going to my Twitter, to my pinned thread. I keep that ongoing. I think I'm in like 90 or something tweets now, as far as different individual pieces of evidence, different papers, different things that we've learned. And yeah, check out my book, and give it a read and think about it. And yeah, just if you agree with this, if you think that basic income is important, especially in light of where we're going with technology and automation and a rising autocracy, eroding democracy, again, basic income isn't going to just happen. So please, consider how you could help, amplify basic income stuff, doing basic income content, hosting interviews, like this, to help people understand it better, and to do something in order to like really help that happen, instead of just expecting it to happen versus on the work of, other people.
I'll read out some comments that have landed on the YouTube live stream. Ryder Vasinius says, good session, much appreciated. Nick Burkby says, really enjoying this, succinctly explained, thank you. Yissa Lial Israeli says, Scott is a great champion for UBI. He's been following and supporting you, Scott, on Patreon for years. If others want to explore, go to patreon.com/Scott Santens. And with that, I will say this is the end of the formal part of the meeting. A few of us will hang around shortly for a little bit of an informal debrief. We'll have a comfort break before then, but anybody who wants to stay around, I will turn on your mics and your cameras if you wish, and we can briefly explore what particularly struck you about this meeting, what maybe changed your mind, and what you think still missing from the discussion, what else needs to be added in. And so until then, thank you very much, Scott. Thanks to everybody for participating.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody.